back then, really nobody wanted naltrexone, and DuPont Pharma was having difficulty with distributing it in the field. The problem is that individuals back then were separated. We had addiction specialists and we had mental health specialists, and they were siloed. We had Takata in one building. We had TDMHMR in another building. Rarely did they meet. And when individuals, clients, and patients had co-occurring disorders, they would be cautious not to reveal one of the side of those disorders. If they went to an addiction provider, they wouldn't talk about their mental health. If they went to a mental health provider, they would talk about their addiction. Obviously, that was a problem because unmet needs will eventually sabotage the best efforts of somebody else. We had great clinicians to address addiction, and yet their clients with co-occurring disorders were relapsing and sometimes relapsing on the mental health side. In any case, there was a great deal of stigma. Stigma prevented co-occurring disorders at the time. I was pretty resilient and persistent and had a good relationship with my boss, Dave Wanzer, at the time. And so we made some changes, and we wrote an administrative code to the state of Texas. And that code required people with addiction training to also have core training in mental health, and people with mental health training to have core training on addiction. And I believe that administrative code continues to this day. We had our evaluators take a look at the outcomes, and co-occurring actually saved the state a great deal of money because people got well. They didn't recycle through us. Let me go ahead and switch this. So what I'm going to talk about today is stigma. Stigma specific to substance use disorders. And I want to bring it home. So I don't really want to talk about stigma in the broad sense. I want to talk about stigma specific to the RCORE grant, because that's really what we're talking about, at least from my perspective and the perspective of HRSA and JBS. So let's begin with a basic description of what stigma is. And this can be changed, and it is changed depending on what literature you look at. But for purposes of today's very brief discussion, stigma is a negative attitude or discrimination against someone based on a distinguishing characteristic, in this case, substance use disorders. Stigma is a barrier to achieving reductions in morbidity and mortality associated with substance use disorders. These are the primary goals of the RCORE grant. We are all about reductions of the problem associated with substance use, specific opioid use disorder. But it's all about reductions of morbidity and mortality. And if something presents itself as a barrier to that, as a challenge to that, we do our best to find a solution to it. Because without that solution, individuals are harmed and the community is hurt. So there are all kinds of challenges to that. There's workforce shortages, there's transportation issues, there are housing issues, there are all kinds of issues, but stigma is one that is based on attitude. So attitude and sometimes misinformation creating an attitude. So what we try to do is we try to address the issues related to stigma. So what does stigma look like? What are some of the attitudes that we might see? We might see stereotypes. We might see in people's impressions of individuals with substance use disorders with a stereotype. Somebody who is irresponsible, somebody who is perhaps dangerous, somebody who is perhaps unpredictable, unreliable. And of course, we can all fill those descriptions based on a stereotype of somebody who is using, or sometimes even somebody who is in recovery. Sometimes people with long recovery, refrain from even mentioning that in certain circles because of the potential stigma within there. That again is a barrier. And sometimes it's a barrier for that person in long-term recovery to associate with those individuals, even though those individuals may be close to home, may even be family. We can also see stigma in some of the expressions that people make via language. And it's not necessarily from the individual, it could be agency-wide. Substance abuse is no longer a term that is being floated out there. Instead, it's referred to substance use disorder. So some would say, well, what's the difference between substance abuse and substance use disorder? Why is it such a challenge? And why does it have to be addressed? I mean, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, includes substance abuse in much of their literature, especially most of the literature prior to recent additions. The issue with substance abuse is that it does not suggest a disorder. It does not suggest a health factor. And the problem when you remove the health factor from the issue of substance use is that it's easier to stigmatize somebody. So instead of using substance abuse, we're going to use substance use disorder. Instead of drug abuse, we'll use substance use disorder. Addict. I've got friends who are in long-term recovery and they refer themselves as an addict. They can do that, but it's not language that necessarily we would use, because it negates the individual. It negates the recognition that a person with substance use disorder is a person first. So we refer to them as a person with a substance use disorder, or refer to that as a person in recovery, or a person with lived experience. These are people we're talking about. And when you use the word of abuser, junkie, in reference to somebody who's dirty or clean, that all pulls aside the issue of a person who has a substance use disorder. Now, the other issue of stigma, which perhaps may be more serious than anything else, is the issue of internalized stigma. And internalized stigma is when people absorb the stigmatizing assumptions, statements, and stereotypes, and they come to believe and apply those to themselves. That's a problem. Because if we have an individual who finds themselves accepting the stigma in a community which is negative, that might be a reason to give up on oneself. That might be a reason not to seek treatment. That might be a reason not to hold on to treatment, not to maintain recovery, and not to work on the pathway of wellness. There's another part of stigma that's a problem for us. And that's where it becomes discrimination and affects public policy. Stigma becomes discrimination when negative public perception of people who use or have used illicit drugs, and that includes alcohol, involves negative public policy, little or no access to life-saving interventions or evidence-based treatment and recovery support services. Well, give me an example of when that might happen. Let's talk about harm reduction. 30 years ago, we spoke about co-occurring disorders. Co-occurring disorders was not well received at all. It was not well received by the field. It was not well received by funders. There was a lot of problems. And we had to do national changes and implement national changes to contract requirements to really have an impact. Harm reduction is a little bit like co-occurring disorders was 30 years ago. For some people, harm reduction is not a good term. For some people, harm reduction turns heads. It's not an accepted practice. But the reality is that harm reduction for substance use disorder includes cost-effective strategies, evidence-based practices, both in the public health and social service fields. Syringe service programs. Syringe exchange has been around for a while, and yet there is resistance, much resistance out there. And also a great deal of research out there showing the effectiveness of syringe exchange programs, how they decrease the amount of problems attached to people who are using. And in fact, even the police are affected so that they don't get as many, some of the situations where they're dealing with dirty needles. Housing first programs have found evidence, drug checking, fentanyl test strips. If somebody is using and they use fentanyl test strips to check whether fentanyl's in their drug, that's a good thing. Yet in some areas, fentanyl test strips are illegal. It's illegal here in the state of Wisconsin. It's seen as paraphernalia. It's not allowed. Overdose prevention. Naloxone has come a long way, but originally there was strong resistance to it. And in fact, today there's still some resistance in pockets of rural America and elsewhere. Individuals have expressed to me directly, you know, if somebody is out there and they choose to use drugs, that's their choice. And if they overdose, that's a consequence that they need to pay. You know, attitudes, stigma, guidance on safe drug use has been effective. If people are going to be using, or if people are in recovery, seeking recovery, early recovery, long-term recovery, there's some guidance out there. There are peers that can help them, and peers have taken a huge step forward in terms of solidifying their place as professionals in the field. Safer consumption guidance, not using alone, is some of the guidance that's out there. Well, I didn't want to take too much time on this, but I did want to at least open up for discussion. Because as I said, harm reduction for us, especially with the RCORE program, is out there. There's a great deal of information. Out of all of my grantees nationally, harm reduction is the topic where I have the most requests for trainings, for 4-hour virtual trainings, and when travel is opened up, full day trainings on harm reduction. Those are requested by hospitals. Those are requested by small providers. Those are requested by communities. So stigma is at the heart of this. And I'd be real curious to see from you all what your views are on stigma. If you feel stigma is a problem, what you feel are some of the effective practices to address stigma. And given that I'm your TA provider and I associate with a wealth of technical assistants, both centers of excellence nationally, individual subject matter experts, more than 30 other TELs. We've got we now have close to 300 grantees, each of them addressing harm reduction and stigma to some extent across the board. So open up for discussion. What are your views about stigma where you're at in your catchment area, within your consortium membership? What do you see? What's going on with it? And what can I do to help? I'm going to go ahead and on Jody a little bit. Jody, from your perspective, what are you seeing regarding stigma?
Honestly, I think it's just inadvertent use of language, but not understanding that it's not person first. So it's not intending harm, but just not knowing that there's maybe a different phrase. And I might even pass it off to Stella, who's had a lot of great experience in the community, to hear what she has to say. Put you on the spot, Stella.
Yeah, yes, you did. Well, my stigma really was about the way I looked. I mean, I looked like an addict. I was like a toothpick. So whatever you said about me, it penetrated, you know, however words you called me, it penetrated because I was already feeling it and I didn't need you to tell me how I already felt. But I get that. So, and it just kept us separated, y'all, and I was, you know, separate. Let's put it like that. Does that answer? make you
Yeah.
understand better?
Stella, do you think that that's still out there? That some people will still point fingers and still,
Well, you know, to be honest, I've got about 8 years clean, going on 8. And I tend to catch myself saying, wow, now I see what they saw. Now I get why my son's an addict and he gets on my everlasting nerves when I see him under the influence, and have to watch myself, you know, then I think, golly, now I get it. So, but at the same time, you know, I love him to death, and give him, you know, I think I do more than I should. I think I'm not enabling him, but I definitely baby him, and I know I shouldn't.
Mhm.
It's hard. It's real hard.
Every mother is a smother, Stella.
Yeah. Nancy, what are your thoughts?
Thank you for asking. Well, one of the things that I feel like we should be asking people in the community, but one of the things that Stella just said that I've had a conversation with some of the people in the community is, she refers to herself as an addict, and other people I've talked to also refer to themselves as an addict. And it's a word that we're taught, as people trying to help in this domain to avoid that. But I think people who are on the outside using the language and people who are living that experience using the language are different things. So it's okay for Stella to call herself an addict if that helps her journey, but it's not okay for me to call her that. It gets kind of complicated.
Sure.
Anybody else?
I just have a quick question about the term recovery community.
Mhm.
Whether that's a term of, is it grouping people into a corral that they don't want to be in, or is it a good description for those who have lived experiences, or is there a better term?
Recovery community is a great term.
Daniel, do you use that? Do you use recovery community?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that encompasses a lot, as far as when we're talking about recovery, because we know that there are many avenues and different roads for recovery. It can mean something different for Stella than it means for somebody who just finished a program at our facility. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty strong word, and that's something that we want to continue to build, in communities. Especially rural communities. I mean, we want to be able to have a strong recovery community.
Mhm.
And going back to the stigma, we all know that that national statistic on how many people perceive themselves as needing treatment and versus those who actually go and get treatment. I think a lot of that has to do with stigma. Stigma plays a part of that. Maybe not completely, but it definitely plays a part. And people seeking treatment, because we see it locally here in Victoria as well.
Absolutely. Less than 50%, and in some areas, significantly less than 50% of people that need treatment find their way to treatment. And so stigma is definitely a part of it. Has stigma affected any of your policies? Any policies related to either the Good Samaritan laws, or policies related to syringe exchange, policies related to naloxone? Do you feel stigma has affected any policies in your area?
For us, I don't think so much policies, but I think more of the language. Like you were talking about, the substance use disorder versus the substance abuse, and those types of verbiage, that we've changed internally to make sure we don't use those terms. So I wouldn't say it's much of policy, but maybe more of the way we talk about it in our office environment.
Okay. So do you feel that individuals with substance use disorders in your area are received well in the community and are guided towards treatment by anyone that they're associated with?
If they're reaching out for help, I say yes.
Okay.
That I've seen.
And that includes different populations that may be in contact with first responders, sheriffs, primary health providers. You feel them are welcoming, or are there certain pockets?
I'd say it just depends on who you talk to. You know, this is a real conservative area,
Froze.
self-determined people, cattle ranchers, the oil fields, and all that. And people, you know, suffered a lot of hardships to develop this community, and they want people to carry their own weight. You know, they don't allot a lot of money for programs, but they're willing to help each other. These are some of the most giving. They'll give you the shirt off their back, but they're not going to let you take them to the cleaner, so to speak. And so it just depends. There's a lot of resistance to some of these ideas, but the people that we've talked to and the emergency techs and the hospitals, they're coming around, as far as I can tell.
And Charles, what do you think is causing that evolution in terms of their coming around?
Us getting out there and talking about it.
Education.
You know, I had a online or an email conversation with Nancy. If I'm in a 12-step meeting and I say, my name's Charlie, I'm an alcoholic, or my name's Charlie, I'm an addict, that's me taking responsibility for my drinking and drugging. You know, that's me. There's no pretense in that. I can't hide and say, you know, well, I was brought up in a broken home, or, you know, whatever. I'm taking responsibility for my actions. But at the same time, Bill Wilson also said that anonymity was the greatest of the traditions, because it protects us from outside stigma. And so we had to recognize that. I think there is stigma in 12-step programs. You know, if I'm sitting in there, a newcomer comes in and I don't want to hear about his drug use in an AA meeting or whatever, you know, I might have an attitude about that. Now, the polite thing to do is go up and try and help educate him and say, hey, brother, you know, when you're in here, our primary purpose is to help the alcoholic who still suffers. And we try and confine our discussion to problems related to alcoholism. And you're free to listen and you're free to chime in. But, you know, there are people that might get kind of upset with you. You know, if you couch it, it just depends on how you couch it to somebody. You know, if you talk in those terms, they might understand it. If you go up and hit them over the head with it, you know, they're probably going to have a resentment and might go back out or something, you know.
I could have used you 30 years ago to go to some of the AA meetings when we were trying to spread disorders.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, even today. I mean, that's why there are some specific self-help groups, double trouble groups, that are for people with co-occurring disorders, because there's still stigma out there. And, you know, a lot of the self-help groups, they've got their own protocol, and some that have been around for a long. You've got some established protocol, and that's typically not going to change easily.
Most of the 12-step meetings I've been in the Austin area, like Georgetown and up in there, hardly anybody does not say, I'm an addict and an alcoholic, or an alcoholic and an addict. Down here, if you say it, you know, we might talk to you afterwards, but there are some groups that'll really get on you about it, you know?
Yeah, that's true. So education is the key tool. And is that happening? Do you feel that there's enough education happening, or do you need more? Do you need something different?
I was going to say, I think we need more. And when I always consider, you know, my background in critical care, when they would come and want to teach us about something new, if they could do it in 10 minutes, you know. So sometimes I wonder, is there something out there that could help practitioners or, where we can spread with a 10-minute or short, concise message, and maybe you do have to do it over and over, but they can hear it, but in short bits.
Mhm.
Is there like even just your stigma card, your one slide about the use of language might even be something helpful.
Mhm. Do you have anybody connected to media as part of your consortium?
Daniel and Charlie have had several connections with billboards and newspaper and radio slots.
Yeah, so I mean, that was the biggest thing years ago that made a difference for us in the state of Texas, is that there were these very 30-second blurbs, and people in recovery from co-occurring were shared a little bit of their story. But the ability to have a relationship with something positive in terms of the message is important.
Clyde, we have an answer in the chat from Laura Jordan. She's curious if local physicians are willing to prescribe buprenorphine under a data waiver.
Good question.
Jody, Nancy.
Yeah, to me, that would be a good indicator of kind of the acceptance within the community. If your provider base is willing to do that, that's kind of an extra step. It requires extra training. And it also requires a little bit more, just working with this client and being willing to take that on. So I'm just kind of curious in the community, is that something that kind of tends to get passed off, or is that something that the local physicians are willing to take on?
Well, I would also say Dr. Weston may have some direct anecdotal experience of trying to incorporate MAT training into the integration of behavioral and mental health care with primary care. You ran into some roadblocks, didn't you?
Well, I can speak to the ability for nurse practitioners to achieve MAT waiver, and it exists. So there are some educational opportunities to receive that. I'm pleased to say that we just hired and onboarded a family nurse practitioner who is MAT waivered, and is starting a mobile MAT team in collaboration with a clinical partner in Central Texas that extends as far south as Gonzales and as far north as Llano, or the Llano Burnett area. So that will be an outreach, and she just completed an educational video for us to use with our family nurse practitioner students on the utility of medication assisted treatment in addressing substance use disorder. And so we're really excited about ingraining that in this next generation of nurse practitioners, so it's on the forefront and can hopefully not only combat stigma, but most importantly, increase avenues for treatment and recovery.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah, that is exciting. But Laura, also the TAR Family Medicine, which is Texas A&M Family Medicine Residency Program, they went through training and they can now take up to 30 patients. So we're really excited about that. There's a buprenorphine prescriber in Victoria, Dr. Courtney Roberts, who is also interested in treating pregnant women. So there are a few. I think we found when Dr. Weston did a search, I think she found 2 buprenorphine prescribers outside of TAR in the area. So not very many. And also something we found is that they tend to only take private pay. They don't necessarily take insurance or Medicaid. So been trying to, and they do it to TAR, so yay, they take Medicaid patients, but we're trying to knock down that door too. And we wonder also if there's some stigma associated with Medicaid patients taking patients with Medicaid. So that could be also a stigma related issue.
I think
Can
you're
I
right.
add one more thing? Oh, I'm sorry. One of the barriers, I think, for increasing access to medication assisted treatment in terms of nurse practitioners, ties in with the regulatory barriers that still exist in Texas. For nurse practitioners to practice requires physician delegation of a prescriptive authority agreement. And because limited physicians want to engage in medication-assisted treatment, that's become a barrier for even nurse practitioners who receive the training, receive the MAT waiver, and being able to increase access to the service. So hopefully in the future, as policy changes, that will act in another avenue to increase access.
That's good stuff. I've got to jump onto another call. So is there any other questions or anything else I can do for you? And of course, with the RCORE project that Jody and others are involved with, again, you get access to a great deal of technical assistance and almost anything you can imagine. So keep that in mind. And if there are any follow-up questions or anything specific to the issue of stigma or harm reduction or anything else, feel free to channel those to Jody and I'll get those. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Congratulations on all of the good news that I heard today, and keep moving forward. Thank you for all that you do.
Thank you,
Thank you
AJ. We
very
really
much.
appreciate it.
Bye now.
Thanks, AJ.
I'd like
And
to
Laura-
make one final announcement before we jump off here. Our next GCRRI meeting on November 10th will include Dr. Rachel Rube from Waco Family Medicine, who's going to inform us on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. I saw a YouTube of her presentation, and I had heard of fetal alcohol syndrome, but I had not heard of spectrum disorder. And there's a whole lot of stuff in there that goes along with this as it relates to polysubstance abuse and other forms of substance use disorder. So hope everybody will join us for that one. Has anybody got anything else, Daniel?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Well, we got a few minutes. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to say about stigma?
Just that I think that if we can order, put together kind of a small snippet of something to kind of maybe help get it out there.
Exactly.
Just some short information.
We will work on that for you.
Well, hopefully, just to remind people that we are planning that seminar for next spring, late spring, that we'll do some more stigma reduction work there. And primarily, I think, yes, the tool to address stigma is education, like we've all identified. And so that will be an opportunity to provide education to communities and providers and other stakeholders. So looking forward to that.
Did we answer all the questions in the chat box?
Just a few suggestions, and it looks like Nancy provided a great toolkit on stigma reduction as well.
Okay. Well, if there's not anything else, I think we'll go ahead and close for today. And I really appreciate everybody being on here. Thank you for your participation. And we will see you next month, if not sooner.
Thank you,
Take care.
Thank you all.